Yes.
All right, so I'll go like this. John, thank you for that kind introduction. It's really fun to be here. I, of course, have been getting your newsletter, and I check out Memoir and all that, but this new space, which has only been here for 2.5 years, is stupendous. And built on the old San Francisco Mint, as you were telling me, and it's just really inspiring to be here and to see some of the artifacts of things that I've read about but I've never seen myself before. So anyways, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes running through some images and telling you very briefly an overview of the story that I tell in much more length in The White Devil's Daughters, the women who fought slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown. And it is very fitting. We do start not in the 1850s, but in the 1870s, John. So we're not too far off of your 19th century framework for this spring. And most importantly, we start, as you pointed out, exactly in this neighborhood. I mean, literally the first scene of the book, which is a narrative, nonfiction account. It's a history of a very unusual group of women. And the first scene in the book starts on Jackson Street, not very far from here, a few blocks away from here. So, anyways, to go back, I'm going to tell you the story very briefly about a path-breaking project that began with a meeting in San Francisco that took place 148 years ago. And the story is about a pioneering group of women, Asian women and white women, who fought sex slavery in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. And the key role that these women play seems like a very fitting thing. I hope everybody realizes that today is International Women's Day. So yes, we've been telling some women's stories, both Jasmin and I, and this is a story from our own city that I think is a really inspiring story. I found it inspiring, and I'm really happy to share it with you. So I spent about 5 years working in UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library. Big shout out, I know there's some overlap between the San Francisco Historical Society and the Bancroft, which I'm very proud to support. The Stanford Special Collections Library, another fabulous place for the history of our region. The National Archives, and all kinds of other places. But I spent about 5 years tracking down descendants and traveling across the country and abroad to try to piece together the story of this project and the women who were these pioneering activists at the turn of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And my hope is that, especially today on International Women's Day, this story has resonance. And is inspiring for you in the same way that it was for me as I was working on it. So let's go back in time a little bit. Congress, of course, passed the 13th Amendment towards the end of the Civil War. That was aimed at ending the slavery of African Americans. Yet, as most of you may know or may not know, there were still open auctions of Asian girls and women taking place on the streets of San Francisco in the 1860s and 1870s, after the 13th Amendment was passed. Now, how do we know this? We know this because newspapers in San Francisco at the time were reporting on these auctions with a great deal of outrage. And we also know from contemporary accounts that once there was public outrage over these open auctions, some of those auctions moved to more private places. One of those places was a place called the Queen's Room, where young girls, 12, 13 years old, were being auctioned off and sold to the highest bidder. Now, these girls were being trafficked by criminal gangs from China. And this is a photograph that comes from UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library. And it's an iconic photograph of what in the 19th century was known as a slave girl. And literally, she's a girl. She's a very young girl. But in case you think this is only about criminal gangs, you're wrong, because there were white officials in San Francisco that were very much involved with this trade, and they were profiting from the trade at the same time. And many people across the West, in fact, were profiting from a very lucrative business of what we now call human trafficking. But that's essentially what it is. So the plight of the trafficked girls and women came to the attention, first of all, of the wives of Presbyterian missionaries who were working in Chinatown. Literally, I just drove past where they were working, right up the street from where we are right now. And these wives rallied, called together a meeting, 1874, Calvary Presbyterian Church, historic, important church in our city. And they rallied this group of mostly middle-class women to try to set up a safe house. And that was the reaction, that was the response to what they saw as a social problem of vulnerable women and girls who had nowhere else to go. Now, let's just remember, this is a time when women did not have the right to vote, they had little economic or political power, yet they managed to raise enough money to buy this very substantial house. That's the first house they bought, which was at 920 Sacramento Street. And then they managed to staff it and run it for a very long time. So just to go back, the first safe place was an apartment across the street, but soon they bought this one. It opened its doors in 1874. And to put this in context, historical context, this is 15 years before Hull House in Chicago, a famous settlement house that Jane Addams worked at. San Francisco had its own version of this way before Hull House opened its doors. And this home operated for 7 decades, from the 1870s to the 1930s, as essentially a safe house for vulnerable girls and women. Now, the women who began running the home did what they called rescue work. And now that is not a term we would use today. And this is the iconic photograph of that work. And it almost certainly was staged for a newspaper article to try to demonstrate what they were doing. And what you're seeing in this photograph is the superintendent who's looking up. There's a detective standing on a ladder, and there's a police officer with a young woman in his arms. And what this photograph also tells you is right next to her, you can't see her face, but she's looking up at the photograph too, and that is almost certainly the superintendent's translator and colleague, an Asian woman. And I just cannot emphasize enough that this was a cross-cultural effort to reach out to vulnerable women. These mostly Chinese staffers were really on the front lines. They were often the first people to talk to the trafficked girls, and they worked as translators in court. And the white women who ran the home, the middle-class church ladies, essentially could not have done what they did without their Asian colleagues at the time. So I love this photograph, and in fact, you can walk, it's probably a quarter of a mile from here, to that exact same alley where that photograph was staged.
Which alley was this? Do you remember?
It used to be called Donaldina Cameron Alley, and now it has a second name as well, but
I went through the alleys the other day, so I was just trying to remember, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah, it's very close to here. Now we know through log books and case files that between 2,000 and 3,000 residents stayed at the home at 920 Sacramento Street between the 1870s and the 1930s. And as you can see from this photograph, they ranged in age from babies to young children to women in their 20s and 30s. And there were some babies that were born to residents who had sex slaves. And others were orphans who were left to the care of the home. And the women who ran the home were hoping to share their Christian faith with the residents who took refuge there. Although conversion to Christianity was not a requirement for staying in the home. They were essentially a small, faith-based group of activists, Asian and white women working together. And they fought the slave trade for 7 decades. And they were always, always, always short of money. Yet, it's really remarkable to me how much they managed to achieve. They raised the awareness of this issue of, again, what we call today human trafficking. They testified in front of legislators. They helped pass one of the first pieces of anti-trafficking legislation in the state of California. And they hosted an enormous number of VIPs, including presidential party and the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie at the home on Sacramento Street. So today, if you walk a little bit up the hill, you can see exactly this scene. This is what the house looks like. It's built of clinker bricks. And it hasn't really changed very much since it was rebuilt in 1907 after the earthquake. It's still there today, as I mentioned. Today it's a social services agency in Chinatown, and it still sometimes handles cases involving sex trafficking, as well as education for new immigrants. And while we describe kind of what these pioneering Presbyterian women what they did is opening a safe house for survivors of sex trafficking. That's not how they described what they did. What they described what they did as is women's work for women. So it was an early, in a sense, a project of solidarity for women who were more vulnerable than they were. And, again, I think it's a pretty inspiring story for International Women's Day. So what motivated these women? Faith, compassion, probably a little bit of social pressure. And their group of women were involved in this project, and they came together in a kind of camaraderie to do it. But to go back to the compassionate element of it, it was the same kind of compassion. I would argue that abolitionists felt and used to end this transatlantic slave trade before all of this happened. I found the story very, very inspiring, and it shows how, to me at least, a very small group of people can make a very large difference. I mean, just imagine 2,000 to 3,000 girls and women went through there. I had the good fortune of meeting some of the families, some of the grandchildren, granddaughters of women who came through there. And what an incredible change in life circumstances. The women who found their way to what's now known as Cameron House, and they changed their lives because of it. So anyways, I'm going to turn it over to Jasmin, and Jasmin's going to tell us about her absolutely wonderful book, The Bohemians, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. That was terrific, informative. I really encourage you to, if you haven't read Julia's book, it is an astonishing history of a group of women and also the city that we love so much. I am a novelist. I feel like a little bit like an interloper here tonight. I am not a historian. I'm not a journalist. I kind of traffic in lies or exaggerations. But this was the idea. It is a great pleasure to be here as a novelist and to share stories that were born of my love of history, but that depart from it, and especially to do this in the company of my friend Julia Siler. So Julie and I were working on our books. She was working on White Devil's Daughters, and I was working on this book, Bohemians, at about the same time. I think Julie started before me, and she finished, but before Bohemians came out. But this is the first time we've actually ever talked about our books. We're friends. We have spent many hours talking about our writing, but this is tonight the first time we're actually talking about these projects that really, I mean, in so many ways, I see my work as a companion. With great respect, I look at Julie's work and feel like these two books fit together in a really beautiful way. So that was the idea of the program, was to bring together Julie's work as a journalist, as a writer of nonfiction, and to think about the ways in which historians are often storytellers, and we novelists act in some ways like historians. Yeah, there's a kind of fluidity in our work that we thought it would be exciting to talk about and explore. So I'm going to talk briefly about this question of what is the relationship between history and fiction, and then I'll talk to you about my way of imagining a life. So the 2,000 to 3,000 girls, women, babies that were housed and sought refuge in the Cameron House, I chose one, and I tell her story in the Bohemians. So that's sort of how they fit together. So on the question of how history and the novel fit together, you might have noticed that historical fiction is fantastically, terrifically popular nowadays. You noticed? Yes? All right. Not always the case. For many years, it was, in the words of one observer, quote, something of an embarrassment. Literary historical fiction was something of an embarrassment in the world of literature, like an elderly relative to be tolerated out of a sense of duty and reluctantly supported in a condition of genteel poverty. Such was the state of the historical novel. The times have definitely changed as I started out saying. The historical novel is so very popular, but something of the kind of that reputation it still adheres to the historical novel. There's a feeling often that the historical novel is not the best specimen or the highest order of literature, and it's definitely not history either. That it's if you forgive me, it's a kind of bastard form. That it's this form that's neither the one nor the other, doesn't quite qualify as history, but doesn't rise to the level of literature. The thing is, people forget that what is acknowledged by so many as the greatest novel ever written was a historical novel. Can I get a guess, maybe even? Best novel of all time. What do we want? Okay, yeah. But we go back a little bit. Okay, lots of great guesses. War and Peace is the one that I'm thinking of. So Tolstoy wrote a book he did such an incredible job in imagining an epoch that people think he was writing about his own times. He wasn't. He was writing about his parents' generation. So thinking, if you just survey literature, you see that so many of the what we think of are great novels, and the greatest novels are historical novels. They are novels that take on historical personages. You could kind of think that Shakespeare was writing historical fiction from a certain vantage point. The great writers of American literature, E.L. Doctorow, I'll give you a bunch of others. William Styron, Gore Vidal, and more recently Toni Morrison, writers like Julia Otsuka. These are all historical novelists in a sense. So there is a pretty respectable lineage there. If you peel it back, you see that there have been writers engaged with history for a long time, and they've created works that have been absolutely essential to how we imagine the past. Yeah, they have maybe even been more important in the lives of some than works of history. That fiction has been a way that a lot of people have entered the portals of the past. So I'm not going to make any crude, bids that the novel's more, that the novel does its work better, but I'm just reminding us that fiction does impart historical lessons, that it is engaged with history, that novelists and storytellers do participate in the making of history. Where I see myself coming in, though, is that not always were women, for one, acknowledged as important enough to write about. Women of color, people of color, have not entered the history books. And I, as a writer, see myself as someone who's deeply interested in history, but I see so many absences and silences and refusals and just downright ignorance about the place of women and people of color. Some of these stories, you'll never get them. They're gone. The lives are past. The records were not left, or nobody thought to collect. We've got Julie, who did the extraordinary work of excavating the histories and has saved these stories from obscurity. But there are so many stories that probably we can only ever imagine our way back into. And this is where I live. This is where, when John was reading that quote of mine, I love the stories that are hidden or obscure, that you can only get at by dreaming your way back into them. There are a lot of problems, though, a lot of perils in the kind of work I do, and I'll just give you a few of them. What's the limit? How much are you able to imagine? How much should you imagine when you're writing about a period of time or people about whom little is known? How much are you allowed to embroider the past? How much can you supplement the historical record with your imagination? How many details are too many details? You know, a story could really lose its readers if it's stuffed too full of historical details, right? How can you still be authentic to a life while going beyond the borders of what's known? So these are some of the perils. So lots of possibilities, but also a lot of terrific, lots of perils, but lots of terrific possibilities as well. So to go to my recent book, The Bohemians, I'm just going to ask. Yeah, terrific to get my slides because I have some too. Terrific. So we know this woman. Yeah? This one I think you can guess right away. Who is it? Dorothy Lang. There she is atop her car. This is an iconic image of our great American photographer, documentary photographer, Dorothy Lang. The Bohemians is a novel about a young Dorothy Lang. It envisions the story of when she first came to San Francisco. So before she was a woman sitting, atop her car with the camera and taking these extraordinary pictures. And here is one of them, probably the most famous picture of all time, Dorothy Lang's 1936 Migrant Mother. Before she was taking those photographs, she was a portrait photographer here in San Francisco. A lot of people don't know Lang of this period. They really just associate her with her work during the Depression. I got really interested in looking at who she was before she became an icon. So in 1918, Dorothea Lang comes to San Francisco. She's actually her name is Dorothea Noakeshorn. When she gets on the train back in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is where she was from, her name is Dorothea Noakeshorn. She travels to San Francisco. She's on a trip around the world. She gets marooned in San Francisco. And this is the place where she finds herself, the place that she never meant to stay. She was robbed on her very first day here in San Francisco, so she could not travel the world. She was stuck in San Francisco, and this is the place that made her as a woman and also as an artist. But a lot of people don't associate Lang at all with, if you know White Angel Red Line, you know some of those early works, but they don't necessarily know the Lang that came here in 1918, penniless, with very few resources, and within a couple of years was one of the most prominent portrait photographers in the city. So this is the Lang that we get to meet, the one who finds herself in San Francisco, and here she is at about the time that we meet her in Bohemians, when she washes up here in 1918. Spanish flu is about to hit town. We're still in World War I. It is also a segregated city that she enters. She finds herself in this place, which is Montgomery Block, affectionately known as Monkey Block. this was, and I'm sure some people here know the history of this place, but it was the artistic hub of San Francisco. So it wasn't built as an artist colony originally. It housed newspapers and lawyers' offices and, all kinds of respectable businesses. But toward the end of the 19th century, it became a little run down, and this is when the artists come scrambling and sashaying into what they call monkey block. The artists love these tall windows here. They love the proximity to North Beach. They love the proximity to Chinatown. It's really, this building and their world was at an intersection of many cultures, many different kinds of people. So it was a really vibrant place. And Lang marries, arguably he was called, a lot of people call him the King of Bohemia. When she comes in 1918, she marries a painter named Maynard Dixon, whose goddess, he had a studio very close to Montgomery Block, and he was very much part of the scene down there in this kind of left bank of San Francisco, if you want to call it that.
What is that cross street?
This is where the Transamerica Pyramid is now. So it's Montgomery and Washington. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have said that. It's where the Transamerica Pyramid stands now. It stood for 100 years. It survived the 1906 earthquake and fires because it was the first building, I think, in the city to have been built of concrete. So it survived, and it was, for a time, it was an artist colony. Mark Twain lived here, Frida Kahlo sort of passed through here, many painters, journalists, artists of all kinds of stripes came through and either had studios or were part of the circles in this space. Then in the 1950s, it gets torn down. There's not yet much of a movement for historic preservation of buildings. My understanding is it just kind of missed the activism that might have saved it. It was a parking lot for 10 years, and then it becomes a Transamerica Pyramid.
Between Clay and Washington then.
Clay.
Correct. So I'm a professor too, so I give long answers.
No,
And people have to listen to them. These are some of the Bohemians. This is an earlier group, a tribe. I think this is also a stage shot. I think they know they're being photographed. But they were cheeky, fun-loving, fierce-loving folk. They also, to an extent, embraced women in their company. It was still pretty renegade to have this kind of mixed company in America. It struck Lang as very, very interesting, the ways that the genders mixed in San Francisco. This is the inside of Copas, which was at a time, at a certain point, it was in Montgomery Block. And I think some of you know the history of Copas, but these fantastic murals, they were made by, in some cases, these hungry, impoverished artists traded their art, made these murals in exchange for plates of pasta and some oysters and, I don't know, maybe some tiramisu was thrown in too. But they painted these murals at Copas in exchange for food. And it was, I think, a really extraordinary place for as long as it lasted. It enchanted me when I learned about it the first time. So as much as I was drawn to Lang, I was drawn to the world that drew her in. This is the brochure to her studio at 540 Center Street. The building is still there. I think it's not occupied at the moment, but you can go and see it. And this is a side of Lang that I think is really, it's discomfiting even, because we think of her as a documentary photographer of the impoverished. Well, she was catering very much to the wealthy of the city. This is a brochure that would have gone out to this sort of clientele that she very specifically positioned herself close to Union Square, where the fancy ladies of town might be shopping or going out to tea with various people, going out to tea. And so this is where she began. She was photographing the Levi Strausses, the Lilienthals. She was a photographer who, in her words, you went to if you could afford it. And here she is at 540 Center Street. Now, I've never shared this with anybody. I swear I haven't shared this with anybody, because people tell me the novel's about Dorothy Lang, but it's also about Dorothy Lang's Chinese American assistant. And this is the point of contact with Julia's work, is that as I was reading about Lang's life, I encountered this paragraph in the biography by Linda Gordon, and it's so small. On my screen, it's really small, but I'll go ahead and read it. You entered Lang's studio through the Tollerton Gallery, passed to a courtyard where a semicircular pool and a fountain spitting water out of a lion's mouth, then entered the studio through French doors. The large reception room featured a fireplace, usually lighted, velvet drapes, and a large black velvet couch facing the fireplace. Lang decorated the studio in Bohemian style, with exotic arts and crafts objects scattered about. A taste she had picked up from Arnold Gente, who's the photographer you likely know of those images of Chinatown before the earthquake, and of the earthquake itself. He was her mentor. So going back to this description of her studio, a taste she had picked up from Gente, she turned her studio into a kind of salon. She acquired a Russian samovar, and late every afternoon there was tea and tea cakes from a famous old San Francisco baker, Epler's, for whoever dropped in. Some people seem to know Epler's. Is it still here? All right, terrific. Great to know that. They were served, and this is the part that really got me. There was no going back after I read this. This was served graciously by Lang's receptionist, i.e., a beautiful Chinese mission girl. That is, she had been educated in a Christian mission school. She had a merry sense of humor and was very popular with Dorothea and her customers. And it goes on to describe the kind of the milieu here. There was dancing, they played jazz records, and so forth. But this mention of the Chinese American assistant was so interesting. And this is where Caroline Lee was born, was by my absolute fascination with who this woman might have been. So here she has a name, but in most accounts of Lang's life, she has no name. She's just the mission girl, or she's just the Chinese assistant. And you know very little about her. Nobody thought her story was part of Lang's story, that it counted, that it needed to be recorded. And it's one of the stories I was saying, probably we're only ever going to get it through imagination. So, first clue, Cameron House. You recognize it now because Julie gave you that wonderful introduction. If it was a mission home, likely could have been, probably was, the one at 920 Sutter Street that was run by Donaldina Cameron. So in the novel, you meet Caroline, you learn her story, how she came to dwell in this home, her origin story, and you learn the story of Donaldina Cameron. So Cameron is a character in my novel, Bohemians. You recognize this as Julie showed it. You also witness in my novel, Caroline Lee is rescued in an event like this. So what were my sources? Because I say maybe there are some stories you can only get through the imagination. But there are, I think there should be limits. And I think that the best historical novels, the best novels, are infused with a great knowledge of the past, as much as you can get. So I started by researching Chinatown, looking at a lot of photographs. For novelists, photographs, at least for me, are very evocative. The deeper I went into the project, the more I learned about the racial politics of the era. James Phelan is James Farrell in the novel, but he is, his politics were very much the same. There are whole sections of speeches that were Phelan's in the Bohemians. These are actually campaign posters that Dorothy Lang would have seen papered around San Francisco in 1920 when he was running for re-election. So in the novel, Dorothy Lang, through her assistant Caroline Lee, gets a real education in what it is to be a woman of Chinese heritage in San Francisco at this time. Other sources, though. These two ladies were really important to me. They are the Eaton sisters. They were Eurasian, so I made Caroline Lee Eurasian, mixed race, we would call her now. Really, honestly, because that's an experience I know where I felt I had a certain, my own understanding of what that might have been like. And so, it also added more complication, because at this time to be mixed race absolutely alienated you from both communities. So you were neither accepted by whites nor by Chinese entirely. And Caroline is stigmatized doubly because she is mixed race. So these two sisters, they were sisters who grew up in Canada. They had a Chinese mother and an English father, and very conveniently they were writers. This sister, Edith Eaton, wrote, and she became probably the mother of Chinese American literature, they call her now. She wrote a memoir, very helpful, because when you're writing historical fiction, one of the perils is imposing your idea, the present, into the past. And especially when we think back, how do we access the interior of people's minds at that time, yeah? Memoirs are really helpful. So Edith Eaton's memoir, probably the first memoir by an Asian American woman, was extraordinarily helpful to give me a sense of what it would have been like to be Eurasian mixed race at that time in history, different than it is now. This is Edith Eaton's sister, who, while Edith was because she wrote stories about Chinatown, Chinese Americans, her sister was passing as Japanese. Very interesting, very complicated, problematic in all sorts of ways, but how fascinating that in the 1900s, early 1900s, you could perform your identity as a woman of color. So interesting that these two women shared exactly the same background, would choose such different ways of expressing themselves. So in the novel, Bohemians, I gave Caroline a little bit of this defiant spirit. And it was informed, this defiant spirit was informed by these two sisters who had such radically different ways of expressing themselves. So I have to, again, tiny.
It's easier to read.
Is it read? I should just have it out.
Yeah, that's right.
My God, what did I do?
You're fine. One more.
There you go. Okay, I won't touch anything. All right. She could move in and out of character right in front of you. She'd tip her chin down, clasp her hands in front of her, and still her face. And there she was, just everyone's idea of a Chinese servant. Sometimes, just every so often, and only with the people she liked, she'd drop the act. She'd start out quiet and demure, and then she'd say something in her perfectly accented English. What she seemed to most love was surprising people, playing up the contrast between the character they saw and the American girl she was, all insouciance and pluck. She must have held some measure of power, calling out people's preconceived ideas of who she was, making a game of what had, and still sometimes did, hurt her. Out in the streets, she was only ever a foreigner. But here at 540 Sutter Street, she could trick you into seeing who she really was. A bit of everything. A bit of everything. So I'm nearly done. I'm almost to the end. As you research, so much of research is being guided by your curiosities. One of my long-standing curiosities and fascinations is style, fashion history. So Caroline in the novel is a dressmaker, and the story of how she outfits herself, the way she fashions herself, is intimately connected to her profession as a dressmaker. And that would have been one of the few available professions to a woman in this era. The girls learned to sew at Donaldina Cameron's house. And this is Mae Wong, who would have been a few years older than than my Caroline Lee, but boy, did Aunt Mae Wong know how to use clothing and style to defy people's expectations of what an Asian woman was at this time. So my sources are many. They are as, they are as disparate as some of these sources that I showed you. But in bringing them together, I was able to fashion a story about Dorothy Lang and to fill in what I saw as a terrible absence in the story of Lang, in the story of San Francisco, and in the story of women and their contributions. So this is the novel, it's what it became, and if you are interested in pictures and stories, I've got a lot of them in this companion book that I created for Bohemians. You can easily snag it should you want to go on my website. So now comes the good part, which is when we get to talk to you and to each other. Thank you.
Well, so let's start with questions. Let me just mention one thing that I remember. Back many years ago, I was doing some research, for both of you actually, doing some research on a particular person in the Motherlode in 1854-52. The state, that was the census of 1850 was federal. They needed to challenge whether California had that many people, so California had its own census in 1852. So I can't tell you where I got this, but here I'm going down this line, and here are all these Chinese names. It's all F for female, and they were seamstresses, and they were this, and they were that, and everything else. But the enumerator couldn't help himself. The above-named Asiatics are all prostitutes.
Ah.
They're all girls from 18 to 23, something like that. There's a little punky little town in the Motherlode someplace. So it's just, and what did I do? I just put it in my head. I didn't copy it down. I didn't record which town it was in, but I do have that memory that it's vivid. And it's not just here in San Francisco. In the 1850s, the same exploitation of Chinese girls was going on, and they brought the girls over who were great value as not as seamstresses. Enough said. Right here.
Yeah, this is a question for Julie. How did you happen to get interested in that particular topic?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I was born in California, loved San Francisco, and just started reading deeply about San Francisco history, and came across Donald Cameron's first-person recollection of what happened on the morning of April 18th, 1906. And she had a startlingly strong voice, and I thought to myself, this is interesting. How much more is there about this woman and about this house? And as someone who writes history, I'm always looking for primary documents, primary voices. And I realized, there was a lot of material to work with. There were church records, there's a private archive at the Cameron House, there's just this enormous treasure trove of material that I could pull. And that's what got me interested in it. And in that house, as almost a conceit, was a beautiful way to tell the larger story of San Francisco between the 1870s and the 1930s. It encompassed so many dramatic moments in our city's history. So that's, that's what got me interested. But thank you for asking.
I have a question for Julia. With these women,
Oh, like that?
I think everyone can
No,
hear it.
but that's what he's saying.
Julie can repeat it too.
Obviously, slavery was illegal, so these women
Weren't doing anything, since slavery was illegal, these women weren't doing anything illegal, but were there repercussions? Like, were they threatened? I mean, because they were, in some people's minds, they were stealing property, even though, slavery was illegal.
So absolutely, there were repercussions and they were punished. there were a series of laws passed to try to prevent the importation of women into the United States. And one consequence would be being deported.
Yes.
Anyways, the women were punished even though the people who were profiting from their labor essentially were often not punished. I hope that answers your question.
I think I didn't ask the question.
Oh, okay, sure.
correctly then. What I meant were these white middle-aged church ladies punished because, I mean, that was a question because even though they were doing important work and slavery was illegal, I mean, I could see how like people would come after them or their husband and say, you're stealing my property.
Oh, got it. Thank you so much for clarifying. Absolutely, they were physically threatened, they were harassed, they were sent letters, they were most importantly legally harassed, sued, handed writs, ended up in court multiple times with people essentially, traffickers essentially saying you have no right to hold these girls or these young women. So absolutely, and probably the most dramatic instance of that was the placement of dynamite around the house. I mean, there were a lot of threats to the safety of these women. So it was
And death threats.
death threats.
I can imagine.
Yeah, they were really brave to do this. You know,
Suffragettes in a way.
Yeah.
Really harassed.
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. It's great. Sorry I missed it.
I don't know, I just wasn't clear.
Well, we had a microphone fight going on. Right.
Any other questions?
Well, one of the things you didn't mention in terms of Cameron House, girls were not given an education. So not only were they taught skills, in case of sewing or whatever else, they were also taught to read and write. I don't know if they were taught their own Chinese language or not. I assume that's true as well. So they, the girls were not getting an education, and for a while,
They were not?
they were not.
getting an education.
They were getting an education at Cameron
Yeah,
House, but
before, yeah, they were
schools did
illiterate,
not
yeah.
take boys, let alone girls. That would change later on.
That would change, as a result of the laws they did have.
So we-
But that's a very good point. It was very unusual, and education played an important role in the change trajectory of some of those young women. One of my favorite characters in the book was this young woman who came through Cameron House and ended up as the first Chinese American graduate of Stanford University. And through a lot of support.
And it was a woman.
It was a woman, yes.
But it was also very limited, which is, I'm afraid to use this, lest it screams and screeches. But also the limitations. So Caroline did benefit, in my novel, she benefits from this education, but she can only get a job in the basement of the White House, which is a big department store downtown, and even there, eventually she's fired. And I think that was, as I was reading Julie's account and others, is they often went into, service, you would say, or married, but the avenues were very few for these women. Yeah.
I like the part in your book where you develop the relationship back at Monkey House in Julia's little room, and how much she decorated it up, and how much it just blew the mind of Dorothy Lang, who came from, Hoboken. She didn't have a lot of style to herself, and you spoke so well of how she came there with honoring her servant.
Yeah.
If you want to call it that. They didn't see themselves as servant to each other.
Why do we think she wasn't interesting? Why do we think they weren't interesting? They were interesting. What if she was as much of an artist as Dorothy Lang was? She didn't have the opportunities. Yeah, even Lang faced incredible opposition. Throughout her career, she was stymied because she was a woman. And so, but as a novelist, you get to
Freedom.
you get to restore a kind of dignity and justice.
Well, and to speak to that, we will never know the stories of so many girls and women who came through our city. I mean, there were no records of them, or very few records, and as you say, you know, it's an act of imagination, a very well-educated act of imagination that makes us feel for them. And so
I have to ask you, I don't know if I've asked you this before, but do you ever wish you had my powers?
yes, all the time. I do.
I know, and I don't, you know what I mean. I mean, to make stuff up, because you can't.
No,
You're bound by very different rules.
yes, I definitely wish I had your superpowers.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I don't write nonfiction, is because I can't abide by rules like that. You know, I have to keep guessing and wondering. I won't just stop at there's no record, right? I bet there's so many places. Were there specific places in White Devil's Daughters where you wished you could have invented parts of the story?
Of course. I mean, there's such a big question about their interior lives, particularly Donaldina Cameron's interior life. What was her love life like? She never married, she never had children, but she had all of these daughters, thousands of young girls who wrote to her and sent her birthday greetings from across the world. But what was she feeling? And I had a hint of what she was feeling, but I wish I could have asked her directly.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry. So she was not only the Cameron was not a missionary wife, and she was sort of missionary in her own.
Yes, thank you. So Donaldina Cameron was a Scottish, actually, you know, that she wasn't born in Scotland. She came from a Scottish family. She was born in New Zealand. Her father was a rancher, the sheep rancher, and she ended up in San Francisco. And she came to teach sewing to the Cameron House, which was then known as the Mission House, and had been operating at that point for about 20 years. And she quickly, you know, ended up being the superintendent of the home and did that for another 20 years. She was a missionary. She was hired by the church to do this project with a lot of support from the ladies who raised money all over the state to support her work. But she was not formally educated either. So she had a very, you know, Victorian upbringing. And in that sense, you know, she kept within the Victorian expectations of running a home. But secretly, she actually had a lot of influence in the city and was very highly regarded.
I'm curious about the orphans at Cameron House. Were they adopted by Anglo families or Chinese families? Do you know the history there?
Really good question. There's a book about the Ming Kwang home, which started off, well, originally they were taking in, the home took in babies at 920 Sacramento Street, and there were too many children. So they opened up a separate home in what's now the Julia Morgan School for Girls in East Bay. And then it moved over to the peninsula and became known as the Ming Kwang home. And so one of the women who came through the Ming Kwang home, which was essentially an orphanage, wrote a really interesting book about that experience. And you know, this is before there was really a social services infrastructure other than a kind of private one like that, particularly for Chinese American children. Some of them did get adopted. A lot of them just grew up in the orphanage.
And it wasn't biracial adoption like you see today, where people get a Chinese child in this country or some other part of the world. That didn't happen at the time.
For Jasmin, the marriage between Dorothy Lang and Maynard, were they still married when she took off on her odyssey to photograph the sites of the Depression? And then didn't he settle down in the Monterey Peninsula, I think in Carmel?
That was another guy named Ansel Adams. Or many settled he settled in the Southwest in Utah eventually. But to go back, Maynard Dixon and Dorothy Lang married in 1920. They had 2 boys by 1925. They started a family. And he was really about himself, honestly. He really was. As you know, I think Dorothy Lang was enchanted by him. He was a very charming man, but he also had his demons, and he was very much a solitary person. So he'd just take off and go on these month-long. After they had children, he'd just go for months at a time to paint the desert, while she's strapped with these 2 kids, and then the depression hits, and then it's...
And then his daughter, that part creeped me out.
You gotta read the book. But it got harder and harder for her to sustain this. She was married, they divorced in 1935, I'm thinking, so they were just divorced. They'd just gotten divorced when she took Migrant Mother. And she was starting, the reason for her divorce was really that she started to take documentary photographs, and she began working with a man named Paul Taylor, who was a professor at Berkeley, and was an economist looking at migrant labor. And Paul Taylor brought her in, and they fell in love, and not long after that, Maynard Dixon and Dorothy Lang divorced.
Separated through most of that, wasn't it?
Yeah,
he
was gone. He was just gone for a lot of the time, and but still to this day, a lot of people say she was a terrible mother. She made these splendid photographs, these humanitarian works of art, but she herself was a terrible mother. And I think that's just very reductive and really actually quite cruel. She was, when you look at Migrant Mother, it's a self-portrait. She had been on the road for about 4 weeks at that point. She was traveling, she was trying to get back home to her kids. And she pulls over the side of the road, and we love the things we love because they speak to us. When she saw that woman in the camp, she saw her own frustration and despair, and so I always think of Migrant Mother as a kind of self-portrait with all the complexity that Lang felt toward being a single mother herself. I told you I was a professor, long answers, you just got to.
We like your long answers.
Do we have any other questions? Well, a round of applause, please.